A few years ago, a survey asked homeowners who had experienced water damage one simple question. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the worst, how stressed out are you when it rains? The average answer was 4.8. Maybe I'll start at the beginning. This is me fighting climate change. Let's start at a different beginning. This is our new house. My wife Trish and I bought it right before the pandemic. It's located about 45 minutes west of Toronto, not too far from the Hamilton Harbour. As a side note, it was never raining when we looked at the house. More about that in a second. There was something cool about owning a house from our grandparents' generation. It was built in 1908, the same year the Ford Model T made its debut. All things considered, life was good. Until one muggy day in July. Our ship started taking on water. First in the basement, then from the roof. The estimate to climate-proof our house and bring it into the current century? $43,000. Remember that survey about stress levels when it rains? If the average is 4.8 out of 5, I'm about at a 10 right now.
I don't know about you, but I think our city has to become more resilient.
Right now, people's basements are flooding in this city.
This is an emergency.
I'm not a climate change expert, just throwing that out there. I'm not going to try and convince you global temperatures are rising over some cheesy stock footage shot of our planet. Although this one is really cool. Sorry. My goal is to try and answer a simple question. Are we entering an era of intensified flooding? And if so, just how unprepared are we? We need an expert. I present to you Environment Canada's Zubin Zhang. When it comes to flooding, he's kind of a big deal. In fact, we had to ask the government for permission to interview him. And not that it matters, but his basement also flooded.
Well, every time if I see a huge cloud when it's very dark in my area outside, I'm kind of a little bit nervous. Okay, will my basement flood again or not?
I cut right to the chase and asked him, is rainfall getting more intense or is it just my imagination?
We should not be surprised. And we actually see an increase in heavy rain everywhere in the world because we have added more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And with warmer atmosphere, it simply can hold more moisture, which means when it rains, it just rains harder and more intense. But what is important for everyone to understand is that we are not going to go back. We are not going to go back to the temperature or to the climate that we used to have. The future will be different. We will have more heavy precipitation or flooding, which means that we will be living, and in fact, we are living a different world than we used to live.
If you pay attention to the news, it's easy to see what Zubin is talking about. From New York to British Columbia, flooding made many headlines over the past few years. But what happened in China during the summer of 2021 was unprecedented. Zubin says the easiest way to understand it is to think of a literal river in the atmosphere that just happened to fall on a city.
In Zhengzhou, in 1 hour, in that particular city, it rained more than 200 millimeters. That was the single biggest hourly rate ever observed in China.
风水早点过去吧，然后就是电重新再开一下。
Over one day, the amount of rain they received was more than what they typically have in a year. Regardless if we like it or not, we need to adapt to this kind of new world, even though at the same time, we work very hard to reduce emission, to mitigate climate change.
After talking to Zubin, it's clear my house was built for a different climate era. When it comes to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, a lot can change in 100 years. Gord Perks, a municipal politician from my old neighborhood, has a lot of experience with flooding and climate change strategy. And surprise, surprise, Gord's basement also flooded.
So we had to break up the basement floor, and I will tell you, I don't want to ever live through that again. I have to be honest, I now expect a 100-year storm every 2 years.
I understand where Gord's coming from. Toronto's been battered with some serious rainstorms over the past 10 years, and you can get a little fired up in city council meetings debating the issue.
Councillor Perks to speak.
Right now, people's basements are flooding in this city. The city that we live in now is not built for the weather we're going to be living in from today and into the future. You know, I hesitate to put a dollar figure on it, but it's something north of $1 trillion just to make Toronto ready for a different climate.
I've always respected Gord. He's been fighting climate change since before Al Gore won his Oscar.
Back in the late 80s, we were saying, don't spend all your money on adaptation, spend it on mitigation. Do the things that we can do to prevent the climate from changing. We lost that fight. That fight is gone. We already live in a changed climate. We already are seeing these massive forest fires, massive floods, massive droughts, massive heat waves, taking a toll on our infrastructure. That's just going to happen. We get these incredible storms every couple of years. And in each of those instances, we have had examples of complete infrastructure fail. Those storm sewers were not built for these intensive rain events that we're going to get in a changed climate. Where the real big bucks come is completely changing all the infrastructure under the ground.
Gord believes a stormwater tax should be charged to the corporations who own giant parking lots in the city. The runoff from these massive concrete pads often overwhelms sewer systems and leads to flooded basements.
They're just big flat concrete surfaces that are built to accommodate the Christmas shopping rush. And what a stormwater charge tries to do is look at the amount of hard surface on your lot. That hard surface is something we have to pay for as a society. So you have to pay to help us manage that cost.
It seems like figuring out who's going to pay for flooding disasters is $1 trillion question. Insurance may not seem like the most exciting topic. No kid says they want to go into risk management when they grow up. Well, except maybe Blair. For him, statistical analysis is a second language.
By 2030-35, we're going to have another 1.2 billion people to 1.5 billion people on top of the 7.9 billion people we currently have. Since you guys came here, there's 9,000 more people on the planet, right?
Blair Feltmate is the head of the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Based in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, Blair's team examines risks associated with climate change. It's supported by a corporation who is the largest provider of property insurance in the country.
From 1983 up to 2008 in Canada, the insurance industry could count on paying out between about $250 to $450 million per year in catastrophic loss insurable events. Any event like a flood, fire, hailstorm, windstorm, whatever it might be. But everything started to change from 2009 onwards. The catastrophic loss payouts have been over $1 billion per year, every year, for 11 out of the last 12 years. And the factor that's driven the greatest increase that we've realized over that period of time is too much water in the wrong place. Flooding is the #1 cause of climate change in Canada, and specifically residential basement flooding.
It sounds like my house got hit with what Blair calls a water bomb.
One form of flooding is now water bombs, if you will. Very large volumes of water coming down over short periods of time in discrete locations, which contributes to both overland and urban flooding simultaneously. And this is very, very problematic because for a weather-induced flood in Canada, the average cost of basement flooding is $43,000. And you have to pay out instantaneously that week or the house can become uninhabitable because very often this is sewer water in your basement. This is really, really nasty stuff.
Fixing my basement is expensive, but it sounds like the tip of the iceberg.
The insurers can raise insurance premiums to a point. People are finding out that when their insurance comes up for renewal, they may not be able to get insurance coverage because they're in an area that's deemed at so high a risk for flooding that the premium the insurers would have to charge would be astronomical. Nobody can afford it, and hence they find themselves in the situation of an uninsurable housing market.
Not having home insurance is actually a big deal. If you can't get insurance, most banks won't qualify you for a mortgage. That would trap people in undesirable climate zones and create climate gentrification. Some real estate websites are already giving climate scores to their listings.
People, by and large, when they buy a house, are oblivious to the threat of flooding. We've got to figure out how to make adaptation to climate change with features built into a house to mitigate flood risk equally attractive or sexy as the granite countertops in the kitchen. We still have a philosophy that's management by disaster. We wait till a disaster occurs and then everybody gets interested. But we've got to get ahead of the curve on climate change, and we've got to start to manage risks, not just disasters.
Blair says engineers are mission critical for forward movement in preparing for climate change. Funnily enough, the best engineering firm in the country is a short drive from where I live. RWDI has worked on 7 of the top 10 tallest buildings in the world, and even consulted on the redesign of the Great Mosque of Mecca, which is located in a region affected by flash flooding and record-breaking rainfall in the last 10 years. Mike Williams is an engineer and a vice president of the company.
Yeah, my dad was one of the founding partners. I actually remember as a student seeing him referenced in the code book that we were studying, which was kind of funny. We are absolutely world-renowned for understanding the way that the natural environment interacts with the built environment. And so a natural evolution for us is, as the climate is changing, we're now becoming the go-to to look at how built structures are going to perform within these new and uncertain climate realities.
Out of all the experts I spoke to about the effects of climate change, I found Mike to be the most convincing. Part of his job is to analyze weather data. And when you use that information to construct a building, the stakes are high.
So this is no longer just about trying to create spaces that are enjoyable. This is about people's lives being at risk as a result of these changing climates. When we're doing an engineering calculation for a building, the main driver for that is what is the outdoor temperatures. Well, what is the outdoor temperature that you're assuming, and where did that assumption come from? When we looked at this historic data, it showed that Southern Ontario has shifted a climate zone over the last 60 years, which is significant. When we projected this work out into the future, we saw Southern Ontario shifting another 2 climate zones. And so when you start to think about that, the design assumptions and decisions that you're making today based on a particular climate zone, the building is by definition underprepared.
Preparing a building for a new climate also means reevaluating traditional construction materials. 8% of the world's carbon emissions comes from building with concrete. Don't get me started on concrete. The world is obsessed with it. In fact, China used more concrete in 3 years than the United States used in the entire 20th century.
These floors that you see here actually removes literally thousands of tons of concrete, which is a significant contributor to our overall climate change challenges.
Innovative engineers like Mike are becoming a bigger part of the climate change conversation. His company worked with architect Michel Zurib, who proved it's possible to design a climate change-ready building using natural materials.
We looked at what it would take if we built this building out of concrete compared to what would happen if we built it out of mass timber. And the embodied carbon footprint was cut in half. 80 Atlantic is the first mass timber office building to be built in the city in 100 years. We also have a storm cistern which sits underneath the building where the water's collected and held there and then slowly released into the municipal stormwater system over a period of time. We're 3 times as likely to have a major weather event than we were 50 years ago. So investing in things like climate mitigation and climate adaptation become increasingly important to driving the value of your building in the future.
I think we've reached a point in the film where I can talk about a personal hero of mine. His name was Duff Roblin. Never heard of him? Don't worry, no one has. He was a local politician who prepared his community for climate change decades before anyone knew what it was. Winnipeg is located on one of the flattest areas of North America, and the Red River runs right through the heart of the city. It's a flood risk nightmare. In the 60s, Duff Roblin spent millions digging a 47-kilometer channel to redirect part of the Red River's flow around the city to minimize flooding. Duff's little project excavated more earth than the Suez Canal. The people of Winnipeg thought Duff was nuts and mockingly nicknamed the project Duffs Ditch. 60 years later, and Duffs Ditch is estimated to have prevented $40 billion in flood damage and saved countless lives. This is not Duffs Ditch. It's better. And it's currently being built in my hometown of Toronto. It's called the Portlands Project, and it's an artificial river designed to prevent flooding. David is in charge of building this place. He's a new Duff Roblin. We'll meet him in a minute. Toronto has been going through a condo boom. This means more concrete, more paved surfaces, and less opportunity for stormwater to seep into natural vegetation. Instead, a lot of that water winds up in the Don River watershed, home to 1.4 million people. David Kisturin is tasked with expanding the mouth of the Don River and building a new river valley to accommodate the excess stormwater. As for how much water we're talking about, I'll let David explain.
Niagara Falls has two different flow rates, so we're actually the same effective flow rates as the evening rate. Just imagine that coming through, a 50, 60 meter wide channel. You can understand the kind of damage that it could do. We're actually creating a new Don River, all the features of a real river, not a concrete channel. Our objective is to renaturalize the mouth of the Don. All of the natural features of the Don River were removed. This used to be the largest wetland in the Great Lakes, and that is gone.
The scope of this project is impressive. I asked David to give me a little tour, and quickly learned building a river can get a little technical.
So this is the what's called an oil grit separator, so that will remove many of the largest particles from the stormwater. It then goes into a settling tank. This is a caisson drilling machine, so they're drilling caissons in a circle here, so it's got to be very, very large. So this is a ballasted flocculation facility. What happens is that all of the sediment that's in the water, all the turbidity coagulates. Started putting in the duct banks here. There will be a weir here. Next thing we put on is this geotextile fabric, Star-X treatment. We built a diaphragm wall, carbon activated charcoal. A root wad crib wall, 7,000 trees, 2 million herbaceous plants that would be planted.
Welcome to the future of climate change. Admittedly, I have no idea what David just said. But if what he's doing here keeps thousands of homes like mine dry, I'm a happy camper. As for the $1.2 billion price tag, let me put your mind at ease.
It's a huge investment, but there have been studies that say for every dollar that governments spend on this sort of protection, they save $5 in repair bills. By doing this now, rather than waiting for storms to hit and massive damage to occur.
$1 billion makes the amount I need for my house seem reasonable. And luckily, help is on the way.
Hello everyone, bon début de semaine tout le monde. In the coming weeks, we'll be launching a new program, the Greener Homes Grant, to help retrofit up to 700,000 homes.
In addition to basement waterproofing, my house was eligible for a bunch of other important climate change upgrades.